One of my favorite moments in life is when I discover that a tool that I've had for years has an incredibly powerful feature that I didn't even know about until now. Alright, so I'm working on this project. I've got this camera model that I've spent a few days working on, wanted to practice my hard surface modeling, and now I'm getting to the point where I want to start showing it off. I want to post on social media, Instagram, Twitter, maybe my website, and in order to do that, I need to start assembling this into Cinema 4D and creating a render. And so I'm working on my environments and the backdrops and the things I want to put it on, and now I'm getting to the most important part, and that is lighting. Now, I can't stress enough, lighting is the most important part. It will make or break your render. One way to set up lighting is to use area lights, or the built-in lights in Cinema 4D, or the ones that are hooked up to your renderer. In my case, Redshift. You can make a Redshift area light, place it anywhere you want, dial in those settings, and do everything in-house that way. Another way is to use HDRIs. HDRIs kind of take the whole process of creating a lighting environment and combine it all into one image that you can then switch out, rotate around, and iterate over the process a lot quicker. What if I told you there was a way to create high-quality 32-bit float studio HDRIs in Substance Designer and easily integrate it into your Cinema 4D projects? You can. Here's how.
All right, so we're in Substance Designer. Let's create a new substance. Okay, so what we're going to do is under the graph template part, we're going to go down to where it says Studio Panorama, and a couple things we're going to change here. So first we're going to give it a name. Let's start off with demo graph for now. This is just so I can show you some of the features that Substance has. We'll make a really cool HDRI later on in the video. So what we need to do is we need to set up the width to be bigger than the height. So if the width is 2048, let's set the height to 1024. And under Format, we're going to choose HDR High Precision 32-bit Float and hit OK. Okay, so there's a couple things we need to set up in order to get started. So over to my 3D view, I'm going to go to my scene, and I'm going to choose Matte Ball or Material Ball. So you don't have to use the standard 3D objects that come with Designer, like the rounded cube or the torus or spheres. You can actually use your own 3D meshes and import them straight into Substance Designer. And I'll show you what that looks like now. To import your own 3D meshes, right-click on the package here. This is the graph. You want to right-click on the package, choose Link, and then 3D Mesh. I'm going to choose this camera object here and click Open. Okay, depending on how your UVs are mapped, maybe on multiple tiles, you can choose to set it as a UDIM mesh. I'm just going to hit OK. All right, so when that's done, you get a Resources folder. If you twiddle that down, you see your camera and then Default. And Default is your mesh. So let's right-click, drag this into the 3D viewport, let go. And there you go. You've got your 3D mesh. You can navigate like you normally do. Left-click to orbit around. Right-click to zoom, or you can use the scroll wheel like I do. And middle mouse button and hold to pan around. You can Control, Shift, and right-click to rotate the environment light around you. While this is a great way to keep everything within Substance Designer, and you can choose to work this way, my particular setup involves me using specific materials and Redshift nodes, such as the awesome round corners node. So I'll stick with the material ball because everyone has it, and it shows a good enough approximation for me. So I'm going to go to Scene, and then choose Matte Ball. All right, next up, I'm going to create a base material. So spacebar, base material, hit enter. And I'm going to right-click and drag it into my 3D view. And I'm going to go to the roughness value, and I'm going to decrease it a little bit so we get a little more reflections. And you can start to see what the current environment is doing with this particular model and this amount of roughness. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this panorama output. I'm going to right-click it and drag it into my 3D view as well. And I'm going to click on the bottom option here, the one that says latitude, longitude, panorama. This is the environment input for our 3D view. So let's click that. And now our output is being pumped in as the environment for our 3D view. So the last thing to set up our working environment here is I'm actually going to go to the Render tab and choose iRay. Now, if you have a fast enough computer, I think using the iRay engine, the iRay render engine, is going to give you much more of a photorealistic look. It's okay to be working in OpenGL. It's faster, and you can get used to how its reflections transfer to how your render engine works later on. But I'm going to choose iRay. And now you can see how these reflections are really working with most materials and geometry. And that's why this material ball is so useful, because it gives you those specular reflections, and it looks pretty nice. We also need to go to the Environment tab and hit Edit. And then we need to change Is Visible to True. Now we can see what our HDRI is doing to our scene, and we can visibly see the HDRI in the background. All right, let's double click our output here. What we're looking at in the 2D viewport is the full panoramic image. It's the entire 360-degree view flattened out for us to work with. This image contains the lights that we're going to shine on our subject as it gets wrapped around it in a spherical shape. It becomes a sort of light-emitting wallpaper where our scene is in a spherical room. A lot of people use 360 cameras to capture locations and use those images as a way to supply realistic lighting and reflections to their 3D scenes. Today, we're going to create our own lighting studio by hand so that we can dial in our reflections and fine-tune our result. So what do we have here? Well, the Substance Designer Panorama template has given us a little bit of an example on how to assemble your own HDRI. And it starts off here with this gradient background. So it's actually just a gradient linear node, one that you would use in your normal substance designing. You could change the top color and the bottom color here, and it's piped into these area lights. Now, these are the special nodes that Substance Designer comes with to create realistic looking lights in our HDRIs, and they're really cool, so let's check them out. The first light that we have here is called the Shape Light node. So if I double click on it and bring it up, you see we've got our light here. And if I move it around, you'll see that it conforms to the panorama format that we need in order to create this spherical shape around our subject in our environment. And we can resize it here, move it around. And it's got some really amazing parameters here. From the top down, you see we've got our shape temperature. And if we bring it to the left, this is in Kelvin. So if you bring it to the left, it's going to get a warmer, sort of orangish, reddish tone. If you bring it to the right, it's going to get cooler and head towards blue. I think I'm going to keep it right around here for now. So below that, we have our shape exposure that controls the brightness. And what you can see is in our 3D view, as we move this light around, you see how it changes the reflections on our shape and how it modifies the environment in real time. It's very cool. So the shape hardness does exactly what it says. You can make it a softer light or a more defined one. If I bring that all the way down and bring the exposure down, you see we have this hot spot exposure, size, and fall off. So I can decrease the exposure of the hot spot, bring the size down, and the fall off. You can see, let me just increase it a bit. You can see where this hot spot is. And you can change the position of the hot spot on the light for X and Y. Very cool. And then adjust the fall off, make it softer, adjust the size and the exposure. So you finally get the kind of light that you're looking for. And if you're not satisfied with a rectangle, you can change it to a disc. You have the same properties here. I'm going to keep it to a rectangle for now. I'm just going to bring it right about in the center. It's looking good. Up next, we have a line light node. Now, this is really cool. So this creates a line, but within this spherical space. So it's not really going to look like a line here. But if we pan around in our HDRI and look for the light, there it is. You can see that it's creating this straight line in our spherical form. And you can see it in the reflection up top here. So we can move this around. You can see how it changes the highlight here. Bring it down. Again, you can change the temperature here. And not everything's going to show up in the 2D view. You really have to look for it in the 3D view because that's where it counts. So again, you can adjust the exposure. The line rotation is really cool. So if we look back at our light here, you can see what the rotation is doing. It's as if we're rotating our light in 3D space here. Really get to dial in how it's projecting our light onto our shape. And of course you can change the thickness here. Lastly here, we have our plane light. Now plane lights are really cool. Let's bring this here. I'm gonna disconnect my line light now so we can take a look at just our plane light. So I'm just soloing the plane light here now. That's the only thing that's coming into our output. You can see how it's having an effect on our scene. And we've got a lot of really cool options here. You can show the grid, and this kind of gives you a better idea of where things are in 3D space when you move them around in the 2D and the 3D viewport. See, it's also here in the viewport as well. Another cool option is to change temperature from Kelvin to RGB. And you can pick a color that you want this light to be. You can do sRGB, float, hue, saturation, and value. And this applies to the line light and the shape light as well. You can change the color and get very specific on what kind of gel you want to put on your light. You get the exposure just like the other lights and the plane scale. You can do this on the X and Y. You can turn it into any kind of light that you'd like. You've got X, Y, and Z rotation, and this isn't just squashing and stretching the light, it's actually simulating rotating the light in 3D space. So you can see if I rotate it on the X-axis, it's just as if we're moving the light a little bit to the side. You can do the same thing with the Y and the Z. You can also change the pattern shape to a cone, or many other options here, as well as an image input. So I'm going to place this on the right side here, and I'm actually going to get rid of the line light node, and I'm going to add a new node here. I'm going to add another shape light, and I'm going to pipe this in and bring the output into the background image input, and this output into the background image of this. And the reason why you don't see, if I double click this output, the reason why you don't see this shape light in here yet is because we need to enable the background image input on our light nodes. So if we scroll down, we say enable background input, set that to true. Now we can see everything happening here in our output if we double click, and it's in our 3D view. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this light up to the top. So it's covering the whole top of our HDRI, and I'm going to change it to something a bit warmer. Let's do something like that, and decrease the shape hardness. All right, so we've got a very simple lighting setup in our HDRI here. Let's see how we can export it to Cinema 4D. Okay, so to export our map, let's go to the demo graph, right click, and say export outputs as bitmaps. So you can set a name for it and a file format. I'm going to keep it with PNG for now. Everything else up here is good as is, except go down to the bottom here and tick this where it says automatic export when outputs change. This is very important. So tick that and export outputs. Very quick, hit close, and now let's head into Cinema 4D. Okay, so we're in Cinema 4D. I've got Redshift fired up here. I've got my camera model here that I've imported, and I'm ready to add my HDRI. So how do I do that in Redshift? Well, I go to Redshift, choose Lights, and go to Dome Light, and then find the path, and we're going to choose our HDRI. Here's the one we made. Click Open, and immediately you see this is what our HDRI looks like in Redshift on our model. So you can see by default, it does show the background in the Redshift render view. So you can see our light there. We've got our light on the other side. We've also got our light up top here. and you can see what it does to our model. Now I can click on the dome light, hit R for rotate, and I can rotate this here. See how it affects our reflections on the edges of everything. Looks pretty cool. I'm going to keep it so that we have our bluish tint light here in the corner. And now what if there's something I want to change? So all you have to do, go to Substance Designer, and I'm going to find one of our lights. Let's choose this one. And if I go and maybe I want to make it a warm light, so I'm going to shift it to the left here, make it a little bit warmer. Now, without saving anything, I'm going to hop over, and all I have to do is just move the camera slightly, and immediately you see that map updates, and we have our warmer light. So it's almost as if we have some sort of link to Substance Designer, and here's why. Because when we exported our map and we ticked that box that said automatic export when outputs change, because we changed something in our graph in Substance Designer, it automatically updated this output and then saved out a new image. Then, when we're in Redshift, because our dome light is still referencing the same path, it automatically went back to that image and saw that there was a new version of it and updated it in the viewport when we moved our camera around. And this makes it a very easy workflow to fine-tune our HDRIs in Substance Designer and then preview them in Redshift. So now that we know a little bit of the tools available in Substance, let's create a custom HDRI image for this particular camera scene. All right, let's make a Studio HDRI. So let's create a new Substance, and we're going to use the Studio Panorama template, and I'm going to call this Studio HDRI 1. And we'll set it to 2048 by 1024, 32-bit, hit OK. And let's set up our viewport here. So I'm going to right-click the output and set it as the environment here at the bottom. Create a base material. Right-click and drag that in. And then change our scene to matte ball and change our renderer to iRay. Then go to environment and set it to visible. So now we're ready to go. We can see our HDRI in our scene. And we're using the material ball because it really demonstrates a good sense of what these reflections are going to do, these specular highlights and everything with the camera model that we're using. So I'm actually going to go to our base material and turn down the roughness a little bit so we can see a little bit more of those reflections. And I'm going to delete pretty much everything that we have in here. So I'm just going to delete everything, start from scratch. So the first thing I want to do, let's create a plain light, and I'm going to connect this to our output so we can immediately see what's going on. And it's set to ground ceiling. So what this means is if I drag it around, it's only going to stick to the ceiling of our HDRI, which is a pretty cool concept. But I don't necessarily want to do that for this. So what I'm going to do is go and change it to distance from origin. So now I can move it around the sphere. And I'm going to move it over here to the left. I'm going to adjust the plane scale a little bit. I'm going to change the pattern hardness down. So I want it to be a lot more of a smoother light. So if I double click here and set this to 2, you'll see that it extends this available slider, and I can now increase its size past the original 1 value. And we can see we're now illuminating the left side of our model if this is the back and this is the front. You see that's where our light is. So that's good. We have a light on that side. I'm going to copy and paste this. And now I'm going to bring the output of our plane light into the background image input of our second plane light. And I'm going to enable background input. And then bring this output into our final output. And now I can double click this plane light and move it over to the other side of our HDRI here. So let's see. So now we have a light on one side a light on the other. And what I can do is Control, Shift, and right click and rotate this HDRI around. We can see what those lights are doing to our reflections. So what am I thinking here? Well, I think I want to start previewing what this is doing to my camera model. So I can kind of get an idea of what it's doing here, but I really want to see what's going on in Redshift. So I'm going to switch over to Cinema 4D, and you see I've got a dome light here. I've got a simple setup here with the camera, my camera, and the dome light. So what this dome light is looking for is an HDRI image. So to create that, we're going to go back into Substance, right click on our graph, and say Export Outputs as Bitmaps. Let's make sure that we tick the Automatic Export when outputs change box, and export. Great, so that's done. Switch over to Cinema, go to our path, and choose our Studio HDRI 1. So let's make sure that we don't choose create a copy at the project location because we want this to continue to update. So I'm going to say no. And now we can see what this is doing to our scene. So what I want to do is I want to make it so that what I'm seeing in this viewport matches what I'm seeing in this viewport. And to do that, I'm going to rotate my HDRI so I'm getting a very similar look here. In fact, if I get out of my camera and look on here, let's see, looking pretty close. So now we're getting an idea of what this HDRI is doing. So the next thing I want to do is add a bit of an overhead light on top of here. So let's go back into Substance Designer, and I'm going to choose a new light that we haven't used before, and that is the sphere light. So the sphere light has some interesting properties. Let's bring in the background image input and then connect it to our final output. And before I enable the background input, I just want to see what I'm doing specifically with this light. And so what you can see is it's exactly what it says it is. It's a tiny sphere that's lighting our scene. We can increase the radius and the exposure. I'm going to increase the radius to like 3 for now. And I'm going to bring it to the top of our scene. See how that's going. Yeah, so that's doing the top. And we can add some shading to this. So there's a couple different shading models here. Limb darkening is one of them. You see it adds a bit of shading this way. You also have shading light. So I'm going to stick with that one. Adjust a little bit of the exposure. And I'm actually going to bring the temperature down to a bit of a warmer tone. And now I'm going to enable the background input and see how all of these interact together. Good, so we have that warm highlight across the top, and we have a bit of a cooler light on the sides. I think what I want to do is bring this light further down. Same with the other side. So let's go back. And a little trick that I've done, so because Redshift doesn't automatically update, and whenever you hit the refresh IPR button, it takes a bit of time for it to update. So instead of changing my camera every single time, I actually make 2 cameras of the same camera. So I'm just going to hold Control and drag down. And so now I'm just going to trick Redshift into thinking I'm changing cameras, but I'm just going to switch to the same camera. And now you'll see that the scene has adjusted. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to remove the HDRI from our background by unticking Enable Background here. So I can just see what's going on. I can adjust the exposure here on this side. It's a bit too much. And I'm thinking maybe I'll try rotating the HDRI around. That's looking a bit more like what I'm going for. I really want to catch these highlights here and here. And so now I'm going to go to the dome light and I'm going to increase my exposure to 2. That's looking much better. So up next, I want to add some small details and some small lights and patterns for things to reflect off of. So let's go back into Substance. And you have to remember that we have the entire Substance Designer node system at our disposal here, which means we have things like blend nodes and gradients and distorts and blurs, all kinds of stuff. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to create a new sphere light. And I'm going to leave these up here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a blend node, which I'm going to set to screen. And so you'll notice if I bring the sphere hardness down, you know, that's okay. If I bring the radius up, it's not quite soft enough for me. So I'm going to go in and add a blur high quality color. Now I'm choosing color because this is a color output. You can see by this orange dot here. The output is orange, which means it's color. If it's grayscale, it's gray like this one. So you can see I can add more blur to this and make it just a softer light. Let's see if we can start adding this into our HDRI. So if I pipe this in, and yeah, so you can see what this is doing. We're just adding some small highlight detail here. So I'll pipe this back in for now. Just going to get a similar angle to what I have in Cinema 4D and Redshift. Great. So the reason why I've made a blend here is because I want to add more of these lights on top of each other. So let's create another sphere light. And I'm going to add it to the foreground of this, double click to see what I'm doing. And I'm going to increase the radius quite a bit. Let's go to 3. Bring the hardness down. I'm going to add another blur, high quality color. Crank up the intensity. And I can use the opacity slider of my blend to bring down the brightness and intensity of this new bigger sphere light that's brought into the foreground input of our blend. So let's bring that down here a little bit. Now, let's add some more lights. Create a sphere light. Create a blend. We'll put the previous lights in the background. Put this new light in the foreground. Double click on this blend. Set it to screen. And let's see, where do I want to put this one? Let's put it down here. And let's make this a small one. And let's blur it. And connect this up to the foreground here. And let's play with the intensity a little bit. Maybe we'll just make this one slightly blurry. And also in the sphere light, I'm gonna bring up the exposure a little bit. Now maybe we'll add one more of these. So let's continue the process. We'll slide everything over. Let's make that blend and set it to screen. And let's create that sphere light. Pump it into the foreground. And let's see what I want to do with this one. Let's take the others and put it into the background. See what's going on. Maybe I'll move it over here. Bring up the radius a tiny bit. And I want to blur this one. Quite a bit. And let's increase its exposure. So we're just creating some interesting light shapes that will cause some interesting reflections in our camera. Great. So now I want to blend all of this together. So let's put this new part in the foreground, the other lights in the background. Set it to screen and pump it in. You can see we've already got some interesting detail here. And I think I want to move this over a little bit. So in the blend that just has these new crazy shapes, let's add a transform 2D. And while I look at my output and click the transform 2D, I'm just going to slide this over to the middle. You can see what that's doing. And perhaps to add even more detail, let's make some room here. I'm going to blend another copy of this one on the sides. So we'll make a blend. We'll put this in the background, attach it to our output, and change the blending mode to screen, of course. And I'm just going to copy this transform 2D, paste, Control C, Control V, and we'll put this output in here. I'll make this the foreground of our last blend so that when we move this, it's going to make a copy of it, and we're going to tile it on the sides over here. So we can see we've got all kinds of reflections and things happening over here. So you can see what our network looks like. We've added a bunch of lights together. We've just added one after the next after the next. We've moved it over a little bit, and we've blended it in with our previous lights, and then we've duplicated it onto the sides. We don't have to save. We can go into Cinema, and I'm just going to switch to the other camera and see what's updated. There, so we've definitely filled out a bunch of our background a bit more. We've added some more highlights, some more interesting detail on the lens here. We've got like a pretty decent looking studio setup going on. I'm just going to go to my camera here and my redshift camera tag, go to the bloom, bring down the intensity a little. Great, so to finish up this scene, I think I'm going to add a reflective floor on the bottom. So to do that, let's get out of our camera. You can sort of see what our camera looks like with this lighting setup from multiple angles. So I'm just going to add a plane. Drop it down to right underneath the camera. Hit T for scale. And just scale this up quite large. Great. And let's make sure that the camera is resting on it. I'm just going to create a simple redshift material and apply it to the plane. And already you can see quite a big change. I want to cut off the edges of the plane in the distance though. So a trick that I like to do is I like to go to Redshift, Objects, Environment, and bring up the attenuation. And that sort of cuts off how far the camera can see. And because that's affecting my whole scene, I'm going to go to my dome light and increase the exposure a little bit just to brighten things back up again. Here we go. We've got our studio HDRI lighting up our model. That's the only light that we have in here. And remember, HDRIs can be just a starting point. You can add redshift lights, area lights from Cinema 4D on here to build upon your scene if it's easier for you to work that way. What's also cool is that this HDRI is now saved to your hard drive, and you can use this in any project at any time.
Well, there you have it. I mean, I had no idea that Substance Designer had this capability built right in all this time. And it's incredible what you can do with just a single HDRI light map. And you can create as many as you like, with many different colors, many different reflections and lights and styles, and you can save them all in a library and create your own catalog of HDRI images. Now, like I said before, HDRIs can definitely be a starting point. Then you can refine your lighting even further by adding in area lights or specific lights that are in your Cinema 4D scene, combine them all together, and really finesse your final render. Well, thank you all so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit the thumbs up. It lets me know that you're watching and that you really like these videos. And if you want to see more tutorials from me, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell to be notified when I post new videos. I'm Jeremy Seiner, and I'll see you in the next one.